Okay, so it is great, to start this pre-event, and we are happy to have our artist in residence, Usman Fall, who is going to begin to prepare the place before we start today's event. Usman Fall, who is also goes by the name Us Kora, is one of our residents, our resident artists, and he is part of what we call the Kora project, which is a Pan-African arts and performance development initiative. Usman is an international artist from Senegal who is specialized in playing the Kora. Is a singer and music composer with hits such as Ma Promesse. Usman began to play the Kora at the age of 7 years, and since 2004 has accumulated over 17 years of professional performance. Amongst his portfolio is performances at the Dubai Shopping Festival, at the Hotel Mont Plaisir in Tunisia, and the Dubai Et Al Fatir Festival, and the 2017 Slam Festival organized by Yusundur, and also he played at the 2018 Codesio General Assembly. He currently features in several of our events, and he is featured to headline at the 4th Biennial Conference of the African Studies Association of Africa in 2022 that will hold in Cape Town from 11th to the 16th of April. Usman also studied English at the University of Sheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, and a very strong Pan-Africanist. So Usman, the stage is yours, and we look forward to benefiting from your inspired performance.
Okay, thank you.
Ousmane. Merci Ousmane, merci. Grand merci, merci.
Debate, which is convened by HUMA and the African Studies Association of Africa. And for the next few months until the 4th biannual ASAA conference, we'll be convening leading thinkers to think through what it means to be human in Africa and to elaborate on the contribution they've made towards these themes and other concepts in their work. And so today, welcome everyone. We have Desiree Lewis, who is a professor in the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of the Western Cape. And we also have, I'll be reading their biographies when we finally ask them to start talking. But we also have S.N. Nyeck, who is a visiting scholar at the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative at Emory University. So just to give just a brief elaboration on the structure for tonight, we'll be here for an hour and a half. We'll begin with the wonderful kora music by Ousmane Fall, who is involved in HUMA's Kora project. We'll then have the president of the ASAA, Professor Akosua Domako, to invite us to this conversation. And that will be followed by the director of HUMA, Divine Far's contribution as well. That will take us straight into a conversation and between S.N. Nyeck and Desiree Lewis. And for these purposes, we will have, if it's okay, Desiree to speak first for about 20 minutes, followed by S.N. Thereafter, with about 40 minutes to spare, we can then open the room for discussions. So not to talk too much because the music is really great. If I can invite, and I know we're all eager to start the program. So if I can invite Ousmane Fall to share with us his wonderful music.
It seems like we've lost Ousmane.
Okay. Perhaps as we wait, may I invite you to the table, Professor Domako?
Certainly. I'm so sorry. We definitely have to have the kora music back. Thank you very much, Wangui. Is my sound okay?
Yes, it's great. Thank you.
All right. I want to show off a little bit. So, Saubona, Molwani, Akwaba, Karibu, greetings to everyone. And a special welcome to all of those who have kept faith with the ASAA since 2011 and who have renewed their membership consistently. And we're also grateful to all the new members who have signed up. People have gone fishing on fishing expeditions to bring us members. People have paid for junior scholars. People have attended the programs, and this evening's attendance is very heartening. And of course, we've also had comments and suggestions about how we can do things better. Folks have lent us their intellectual and their physical muscle power, and we are extremely grateful. So today, as we begin the road to ASAA's 2022 conference with the launch of the HUMA-ASAA Thinking the Human Through Africa Epistemological Debates #1, with two indefatigable feminist scholar activists, Desiree Lewis and S.N. Nyeck, talking about feminism, modernity, and being human in contemporary Africa. It's very exciting. And I think that it is very fitting that we start with a feminist frame, because feminism has always dealt with being human and humanity. And these debates going forward will center on the question of the human in Africa, through African epistemologies. And we at ASAA are extremely proud to be kicking this off with our partner HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town, and to be doing so with today's theme and today's speakers, as I've alluded to. Please permit me to say just a little bit about the African Studies Association of Africa, which was formally launched or formally born, or let me say formally outdoored, during the international conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in October 2013. And on that day, we signed up 184 members. And we've been growing ever since. And we think that for a young organization, this is not bad at all. So our goal simply was and remains to promote Africa's own specific contributions to the advancement of knowledge about the peoples and cultures of Africa and the African diaspora, and that this knowledge and understanding will not just sustain us, but also exalt us, right, and put us where we belong. And promoting and supporting networking and interdisciplinary exchanges among Africanist scholars, centers, institutes of African learning on the continent has been at the core of this objective of the ASAA. And so, hence, our conferences are always held in partnership with Africa-based centers. The first conference was held in partnership with the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ibadan in 2015. The second was supposed to have been held in Addis in 2017. Sadly, events in Addis in Ethiopia at the time made planning extremely difficult. And so at very short notice, we had to move to Ghana. And our third conference was held in 2019 in partnership with the United States International University of Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. So our work at ASA and with HUMA for the 2022 conference is shaped and guided by a recognition of the importance of creating these spaces within and across African borders and with the diaspora for a pan-African intellectual conversation, and to promote that kind of scholarly and intellectual discourse, but also activist and creative engagement as well. And our feeling, our view, our heartbeat is that we can strengthen the ties among Africans and between Africa and the African diaspora, whilst also sharpening and tightening the connections between theory and practice, which is very important. It has always been at the heart of our conference that we shouldn't just have quote unquote academics. So this vision of both the African Studies Association of Africa and HUMA includes providing opportunities and avenues for collaborations among faculty, students, activists, artists, cultural entrepreneurs, however we might want to construct ourselves. And we can't overstate the importance of these networking opportunities and intellectual conversations, one of which, and the launch of which we are having today, especially at this time in history that we find ourselves in, the global pandemic, heightened by medical intellectual apartheid, the continuing onslaught on Black bodies globally, including sadly also on the African continent. And so the theme of the 2020 conference, as well as this these debates that we are holding together with HUMA, are extremely topical, extremely important, and we hope will lead to various types of actions on the continent. Let me say a few words about the 2022 conference, and then I'll bring these brief remarks to a close. So it'll be a blended conference, in person and virtual. We are hopeful that we are coming to Cape Town. As for me, I'm definitely coming to Cape Town, so please keep your prayers alive. And it will be from the 11th to the 16th of April, 2022, co-hosted obviously with HUMA, on the theme Africa and the Human, Old Questions, New Imaginaries. And people can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that this will be one of the first, or among the first, truly Pan-African academic conferences to be held on that part of the conference, of the continent. I stand to be corrected. The call for panels will end tomorrow, the 30th of June, and we shall be opening up for abstracts on the 14th of July. So I am sending out a special call to Africa-based organizations and colleagues to use these last moments to submit panels. We've had panels from all over the globe, but we really would like to see a lot more panels coming from the continent. For the abstract call, participants will be able to choose between submitting to an existing panel or to allow us to, they can submit an open abstract and then we will subsequently assign it to a panel. So let me conclude by noting that we are inspired by the commitment of many people behind the scenes who have literally worked tirelessly over the last year and some months to plan both the conference and this series today. My late mother-in-law always used to say in Twi, and if I can translate it somehow, she says, no one ever says, get away from me with your goodness, right? In other words, we all welcome humanity in others when it's extended to us. I want to thank both HUMA and the ASAA colleagues for working so very hard to put this series together. Special thanks go to the Dean of Humanities, Shose Kesi, for her continuous support, HUMA Carnegie Postdoctoral Fellow Claire Ann Lester for her early work before going on maternity leave, and I'm told that she has delivered a baby. I'm not sure if we have a girl or we have a boy, but we can all join in congratulating her on the birth of her baby and her new job at Stellenbosch University. Our gratitude also goes to HUMA Carnegie Research Fellow Wangui Kimari, whom you have already met, for taking over the curation going forward. For myself and on behalf of the ASAA Executive Committee, I need to say a very big thank you to HUMA's indefatigable director, Dr. Divine, for Divine is a remarkable human being, a tireless and committed scholar, and a true brother. And midawasi bebre. And of course, last but not by no means the least, our immense thanks go to our sisters, Desiree Lewis and S.N. Nyeck, for kicking this off. So may the debates begin. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Prof. Akosua Domako. I will give the floor to Divine to make a few remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Akosia, for those very kind words. I mean, I give them back. I think that there is no better sister to work with than a group of people. And we also thank the ASA, you know, for the confidence that they bestowed on us, you know, for doing this. I think that colleagues at the Institute have really demonstrated that we are open as an institute to Pan-African work, and that we want to be a home to think the world and also to think the continent beyond borders. And we are really happy that many people have taken up that commitment. We hope that in 2022, April 2022, we will all be able to meet here again. And whether through panel submissions or through paper submissions. And we want to welcome everybody, you know, to this space. You can find more about HUMA on the HUMA website, and also more about ASA on the ASA website. But we are here today to listen to two very distinguished and important scholars and speakers, and I don't think I should take a lot of time again, given that my big sister Akosia has already really spent time contextualizing it and also giving thanks, you know, to many people. So thank you, the indefatigable Akosia, the president of ASA, and we look forward to continuing this work, you know, with you. And thank you, Wangui, and also Claire. I think you've worked really tirelessly to make this series run, and we really appreciate it. And we are looking forward to these discussions. Thanks.
Thank you both. We've managed to get back Osman. So I'll just confirm that he was here just recently, I think.
Yes.
I'm here again.
Okay, please enchant us once more with your beautiful music, Osman. Thank you.
Okay, you are the most welcome. Merci.
Thank you so much, Usman.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to say a few words about what you just played.
Okay, so I think I will talk in English, even if I speak French, but I'm better in English, and Divine will help me to translate.
Oh, okay.
Ok, Divine, en fait, sur les deux sons que je viens de jouer,
yes, the song that
le premier son s'appelle Malisayo.
Okay, the first song is called Malisayo.
Oui, et à travers cette chanson, l'auteur tente d'expliquer la relation qui existe entre un éléphant du village au Mali, d'un village au Mali, et les enfants du village. Il y avait une symphonie, une sorte d'harmonie entre l'éléphant et les gens du village.
Yeah, in the first sound, a player is trying to talk about the relationship between an elephant and children in a village. There was a symphony between this elephant and the kids in the village, and that's the story. The first song.
Ok, voilà. Et à travers la seconde chanson, on parle de Bani. Ouais, on parle de Bani.
Yeah, and the second song, it's talking about Bani. C'est Bani ou Bani?
Bani.
Okay.
Bani, ça vient d'un mot manding. Et à travers ce mot-là, il y a un roi qui s'appelle Ngari Wali.
Yeah, so it's talking about Bani, which is a Manding word. So he's talking about a king who is called Wari.
Ngari Wali. Ngari Wali.
The king from Ngari Wali.
Voilà. Il interdisait la corruption. Et à travers ça, il était bien connu parce que c'était un roi qui luttait contre la corruption. Et on lui a dédié cette chanson.
He was well known because he was a king who was fought against corruption, and he became very famous for that.
Voilà.
Thank you so much, Usman. Just to say that Usman is a fellow in HUMA-ASAA Kora project, which is a Pan-African art and performance development initiative. So thank you once again, Usman. And
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And before I invite Desiree Lewis, who's a professor at the University of Western Cape, to the floor, I just want to say that it's because of Desiree Lewis that we came up with this theme, Feminism, Modernity, and Being Human in Africa. Initially, we had given you a very boring, apologies to you, kind of structures to think through. We had contributed gender development and disempowerment, and you very provocatively negated our attempt at trying to bring everyone under fairly generic structures to put forward feminism, modernity, and being human in contemporary Africa. And I think for many people, these terms, depending on what where your biases lie, are either irreconcilable in Africa, feminism, modernity, or being human. But for some, if you are our two speakers today, or even HUMA, you think through these themes in a very innovative way to try and put forward Africa's, textured understandings of these three terms. So just a little thank you to Desiree Lewis, but also just a little context. If I can just read your bio. So Desiree Lewis is a professor in the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. She has published numerous articles, essays, and book chapters in the fields of African feminist politics and scholarship, South African cultural studies, Black women's writing, and more recently, food as material culture. She has held fellowships and visiting professor positions in Germany, the US, and Sweden, and is currently the head PI of an intra-institutional Mellon program titled Critical Food Studies, Transdisciplinary Humanities, and Approaches to Food. And she is the author of Living on a Horizon, Bessie Head and the Politics of Imagining, that was published in 2007. And more recently, I think in the last month or so, if I'm not wrong, Surfacing on Being Black and Feminist in South Africa. So welcome, Desiree Lewis. And since you're the one who so provocatively gave us this theme, I won't even try and prompt you with a question. So please take the floor.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And thank you also to HUMA and ASAA for inviting me. Koswa, Divine, thanks so much. So I've had a brief chat with my co-presenter, and we've decided that our conversation is going to take the form very much of each of us speaking to various issues, and then the discussion at the end, drawing connections out. So let me just go for it. What has for centuries been understood as the human is intimately connected to Western modernity. And we've learned from centuries of anti-colonial political and intellectual struggles that the human is a social construct. Western man as the author and driver of modernity. And his humanity is measured in relation to spatially and existentially distanced others. Sylvia Wynter uses the term monohumanism to explain this skewed understanding of the human. And she echoes Walter Mignolo in arguing that coloniality is in fact the dark underbelly of Western modernity. Unlike some decolonial thinkers, Wynter is optimistic about discovering a counter-humanism. And I'm indebted to thinkers like her, and I share their belief that we can discover a counter-humanism, and specifically an African-centered counter-humanism. It's worth stressing that for centuries, feminists from various traditions have contested the masculine bias of the human. Yet the feminist traditions we've come to value as epistemological challenges also reinforce many of modernity's core assumptions. Much of my work has therefore asked what it might mean to center post-colonial feminism, and more specifically African feminism, in dismantling Western modernity's human, and also to configure a sense of the human that is truly different and ontologically liberating. And I want to raise thoughts on the dual challenge of dismantling and reconfiguring by focusing on storytelling and practice as ways of knowing. African feminist knowledge making is often marginalized in the decolonial thinking of the human. And thank you, Akosua, for stressing the fact that and focusing on feminist knowledge in initiating these discussions. Yet as activists and thinkers, radical African women have consistently challenged modernity. The narrative of global advancement and triumphant human progress has been rooted in discourses and practices of development. And it is believed that only within this perspective can African women, African people, formerly colonized others be rendered visible as human subjects. Much of my thinking about revolutionary creativity and knowledge making involves work on African women writers and artists. I've sought to read their standpoint creativity and knowledge as productive powers that can discover new cognitive domains rather than simply respond to injustice or existing worlds. In this sense, I've drawn on phenomenological thought about consciousness being inextricably connected to a surrounding world. And I see consciousness as a historicized form of being in the world. In other words, we emerge as subjects from inside a reality which creates us as much as we create it. I've therefore had an abiding concern with the sense-making embedded in African women's writing and artwork. And this goes against the grain of dominant and still prevalent, I think it needs to be stressed, readings that see African women's artistic work or knowledge simply as testimonial, as unreflective and unphilosophical reflections of their lives, sort of windows into their world, forms of data that others can then interpret. And it's interesting that many writers who are in fact, whose work is incredibly philosophically rich, like Bessie Head and Yvonne Vera, have been categorized as writing for young adults, which is an indication of how the complexity of their different way of seeing is stereotyped and reduced. And of course, when there's an attempt to see their writing simply as windows into their lives, these lives are actually coded by the modern, non-modern binary. This, of course, perpetuates the standard colonial binary of the modern as dynamic, agential, reflective, and the non-modern as static, passive, and unreflective. Importantly, this framing is not always, especially recently, overtly hostile and violent, nor does it necessarily write third world women out. In fact, third world women, African women, are often very hyper-visible in the industry of work around, seeming to recognize African women's creative work. However, it entrenches stereotypes about marginalized groups' embeddedness in static cultures, obsolete traditions, and irrational ways of knowing. Before we dismiss this as crude stereotyping that progressive Western thought has surpassed, we should bear in mind how persistently narratives of the West, from the perspective of the West, continue to be presented as the grand global narrative of human history and progress. The post-colonial feminist, Gurminder Bhamra, stresses how firmly this version of history that we use to measure human progress and achievements is anchored in Western centricism. She focuses on the way that the three core events of modernity, the French, industrial, and scientific revolutions remain foregrounded in our understanding of democracy, citizenship, and human progress. Meanwhile, the Haitian slavery rebellion, an event often flagged simply as a footnote, in canonical history, led to the independence of Haiti as the first country to abolish slavery and to introduce citizenship and rights discourses that remain central to our measure of human progress. Like Bambara and many African feminists, I'm concerned with displacing controlling narratives of Western modernity as a global engine of change and the globalized evolution of being human. Radical African women have condemned development and modernization discourses for decades. They have done so as activists, as intellectuals in and outside the academy, and as working women who directly experience the exploitative violence of development's underbelly. Development and modernization discourses seek to dragoon multiply subordinated groups into the colonial economy. Through globalized instruments and technologies that include the United Nations and the World Bank, and often also through Northern aid and rights advocacy, development and modernization are touted as panaceas for the suffering of the colonized and formerly colonized. And more, local, indigenous, and often women-centered practice and knowledge come to be coded as inefficient, atavistic, and regressive. So yeah, I think I will leave that there. I've focused so far on definitions of the human in terms of interhuman relations and assumptions made about other human bodies. So I want to turn now to thinking about the human with reference to nature and non-human bodies, which is very much where I'm at in terms of my recent work, especially the work related to food, which is not only about food, but about human bodies in relation to the environment, to nature, to non-human bodies. The domination of colonized groups is rooted in anthropocentric knowledge that defines nature, certain human bodies, and other species only as resources for privileged groups. Modernity's scientific and industrial revolution has in many ways sanctioned the colonization of the environment. It is not natural and inevitable that human beings ruthlessly instrumentalize natural resources and the environment. This is a norm entrenched by Western modernity's anthropocentric belief system. It's worth stressing how African women's ecocentric knowledge long predated the growth of recent Western critiques of the Anthropocene, especially traditions of post-humanism, which have become very prominent in scholarship that critiques in the academy today as a critique of the Anthropocene. African women's knowledge making, as well as their work and spiritual practice, configures a sense of the human that refuses to elevate the human and to instrumentalize the non-human. In a recent book on decolonization and Afrofeminism, Sylvia Tamale writes, and I'd like to quote her here at a bit of length, Africa's ecocentric worldview was, rather obtusely, acknowledged by the world in 2004 when Kenyan feminist Wangari Maathai was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for a contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. And it's interesting how that in itself is framed. The epistemic relationship between indigenous people and nature manifests through their spirituality, clan totems, taboos, ancestral myths, rituals, fables, and so forth. These complex sets of traditional beliefs and practices effectively govern the conduct of indigenous communities. Indeed, they constituted self-enforcing institutions that did not require state to regulate or compel submission. That's the end of the quotation. The ecofeminist traditions that Tamale identifies are echoed in contemporary African women's movements around, for example, the big food industry, the genetic modification and corporate monopolizing of seed, corporate control over land and farming methods. One example that I know fairly well is the Rural Women's Assembly, an activist organization comprising women from various African countries. For many years, it's recognized that what is done to the environment echoes how the environment and nature are thought about. The Assembly's activism is prompted not by Northern concerns with rights, development, or modernization, but by deeply embedded understanding of the reciprocal relations between nature and humanity, of the need for non-extractivist and non-exploitative relations with nature. And I've used this one example that I know sort of better, but there are of course many others. I think very many in Kenya especially. I think we often underestimate the extent to which storytelling shapes our sense of self and guides understanding of who we are and might become. Certain advocates of indigenous knowledge, especially indigenous feminist writers, affirm culturally marginalized stories that work very differently from mainstream and canonized history. And I used the example before of Bessie Head and Yvonne Vera. And in many ways, I mean, we can think about their storytelling as kind of embodying, manifesting this difference. And of course, we need to realize in our struggles for decolonization that canonized history is a form of storytelling. It's selective, it's told from certain points of view, and so on, as Barbara in the example that I gave before of leaving out Haiti in the discussion of modernity and the origin of human rights points out. I've been thinking more and more about how a lot of my work is focused on how stories are told, how narratives are constructed, how discursive worlds are created. Decolonial thinkers, I believe, need to confront the difficulty of dismantling colonial cognitive worlds, what some call the cognitive empire. And as alternatives, the stories that are told by those at the margins, their versions of what is just and reasonable, their sense of beginnings or key events are all crucial. And these are not only obviously imaginative, like the fiction, as is the case in the fiction writers that I mentioned before, and the artists that I often work on. They are also often very grounded and directly shape counter-colonial cognition and non-exploitative practice. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for elaborating on so many crucial points. For me in particular, what is ringing in my ears, your conception of new cognitive domains and the importance of storytelling. So thank you so much. I will pass on now to S.N. Nyeck, who is a visiting scholar at the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative at Emory University, United States, and a research associate with the Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation at the Nelson Mandela University, South Africa. Her upcoming book, Africana Queer Presence, Ethics and Politics of Negotiation, develops a grounded ethics for negotiating queerness in African diaspora. Her other books in this line of research are The Routledge Handbook of Queer African Studies and, with Mark Epprecht, Sexual Diversity in Africa, Politics, Theory, and Citizenship. So please come to the floor, S.N. Nyeck. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is quite an honor to be here and to be part of this first meeting of great African scholars. I was asked to reflect broadly on a theme given to me and in conversation with my own research. What I want to talk to you about a little bit is perhaps the human side of the conversation. What does it mean to be human? And I'm going to do so extracting aspects of my latest research. One aspect is shown in the most recent article I published at the African Journal of Gender and Religion, where I started engaging with negritude, which was a decolonial movement, very well known among Francophone countries in Africa. So my conversation today is part of that reflection and taken from my upcoming book, as it was mentioned, Queer Africana Presence, Ethics and Politics of Negotiation. Here I want to spent some time with Senghor, Leopold Sédar Senghor. It is a very coincidental that Ousmane opened this space for us. But this is also part of my ongoing effort. As many of you who know me, I'm known as a queer theorist, but we haven't gotten to the point where we really drink from our own well. Not just from queer scholars or those interested in the field, but for mainstream Africana scholarship. So my recent interest is to look at what has been said and how can that really inform our own theorization of the challenges and opportunities that we face in Africa today. So if I could give this talk a title, I would be calling it Senghor Streaming a New Humanism. Ce que l'homme noir apporte, what the Black man brings, by Leopold Sédar Senghor, was first published in 1939 at the onset of World War II, which historians have considered as one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Although the battlegrounds were primarily located in Europe, African troops participated in the war on the Allied side as colonial conscript. The conscription of African troops did not start with World War II. Since at least 1857, colonized Africans were enlisted to fight European wars as part of the French army and became known as tirailleurs sénégalais, roughly translated as Senegalese riflemen. The identification with Senegal was because Louis Faidherbe, a French colonial governor of Senegal between 1861 and 1863, conceived of the project of conscription and recruited there the first battalion after his arrival in the colony in 1852. At the onset of World War I and II, this battalion was conscripted from all over Africa to secure various French military interests. Thus, when Senghor is born in 1906, he was born into a colonial domination and occupation in Senegal. As one of the first rated African intellectuals of his time, Senghor devoted his life to the pursuit of freedom, articulating what it entails for Africa and for humanity. He became the first president of Senegal after its independence in 1960 and served until 1980. Yet, it is not his life as a statement that continues to be debated, but his intellectual and philosophical contribution to African political and spiritual imagination, especially the frame of negritude, a humanist approach to liberty based on the worldly and inner experience of all African people everywhere. Buried deep within Africa's interior life is an understanding of what it means to be human and to relate to the world that needs not be reinvented, but rather assumed and lived and deepened. With regard to Africa's pre-colonial past, Senghor heavily relied on the work of the German ethnologist Leo Frobenius to trace the blooming of Africa's creative imagination within the various continental indigenous civilization and wisdom that the German scientists documented. Senghor was known to have been a Catholic Christian, in a country that remains predominantly Muslim. He frequently wrote in conversation with Catholic theologians such as Jean-Marie Maritain and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And these influences are important because they help us understand Senghor as an ethicist and theological anthropologist of the first hour in the struggle for freedom in Africa. Emphasis here is on Senghor articulation of the present as freedom time. Contextually, this freedom time was a time for decolonization of Africana's existence in the world, and his vision of freedom remains relevant to current moral and political debates on identity claims and counterclaims, and to our understanding of what it means to be human. What I want to do here to unpack for the purpose of perhaps queer imagination, the kind of humanism that Senghor intends to clothe the freedom seeker with. Humanism that draws strength from the inner and outer storages of existence. Engagement with Senghor is renewed here to establish a conversation and relevance with queer imagination by drawing insight from his understanding of humanity as a dance of the soul, guiding the freedom seekers in search for meaning and relationship with the outer world. To Senghor, this understanding, a kind of presence that animates Africa's interiority, is quintessential to the imagination of freedom, not just as a thing to be grasped, but as a way of being also. Not as a one-time linear process, but as an ongoing unfoldment of experience and dialogical perspectives that safeguards the wholeness of being in time, inside out, and around. To Senghor, the dance of the soul was crucial to the decolonial struggle in 1960 in at least 3 ways. The idea of an animated interior presence as the foundation of freedom alludes to all artificial and political horizons because it was Pan-African, pan-human, indigenous, diasporic in essence. Put differently, negritude as the deepening of the dance with one's soul spirit was set to triumph over all reductionism, tribalism, colonialism, Afrocentrism, because this spirit blows life into the world without precondition, but not without concessions. Thus, negritude is a heavily trafficked avenue of negotiation with large and narrow lanes. In its broader form, negritude is pan-human and therefore worldly. In its practical form, negritude essentially trades the self-giving and other receiving hearts, spirits and bodies committed to the animation of the world's true effective presence. The negritude self and its others speak of wholeness of humanity as a secure ground for decolonial freedom through confrontation, participation, and communion, but never through the negation of the real. What would this wholeness consist of? It entails the preservation of life and the contagion of life only. It resists death, the death impulse, and all that kills the heart and spirit through political and spiritualized violence or otherwise. From a queerness perspective, negritude provides us with an ethical attitude, one that theorizes nobody's existence as a dead end, but as a life-bearing contagion that animates every being, communally kindled to full presence. On the long road to freedom, negritude covers the first mile with the conditions and experiences of Black persons in the world. In Ce que l'homme noir apporte, what this Black man means, Senghor then clearly outlines what it takes to bring about this présence animée, animated presence. If to be human is to be present, Senghor gives us the meaning of what that entails. The first kind of presence he talks about is the death-dealing participative presence. As previously mentioned, in Ce que l'homme noir apporte was written before Senegal independence and at the onset of World War II, in which troops were conscripted. Senghor started with acknowledging this reality, quote, that the Negro is already present in the elaboration of a new world. It is not the African troops engaged in Europe that provides this truth. They only prove that he is participating in the demolition of the ancient world, end quote. He starts not with denial, but with acknowledgement of the real against the backdrop of what he holds as true. And that is to say, the African Negro is already a builder of a new world, but as a conscript. He or she is drawing from the storage of things already given to him or her by acting as a negated subject in a racialized world. Presence in the war theaters of Europe enlisted the Negro as a death-dealing presence, an agent confined to the deconstruction of the old only. A hired presence in the world of all kinds of proxy wars negates the already ongoing work of building new life without over-obsessing about the old, to the point of transforming oneself into an agent of death. Death does not need extra hired hands. The death-dealing theater distracts the Negro from life. The second kind of presence is the creative and revelatory presence. It is in the singular works of writers and contemporary artists that the Negro reveals his actual presence. It is not only this presence I want to talk about, single art. So despite the general condition of war and death, Senghor clarifies the realm of his approach to humanism. It is creative imagination that reveals and actualizes the Negro's presence in the world. To say revelation is to suggest some kind of disclosure of an unknown fact or idea as the first pillar in building a new humanism as negritude. Revelation is what affirms that life with capital L, or the real, is always erupting, and it does not constantly take marching orders from conventional or dominant postulates. Political convention as wrestling of powers at the time of this essay engulfed the world in a destructive war of annihilation, which Senghor opposes, to which Senghor opposes self-revelation as creative presence. Self-revelation needs no placement in a foreign theory of violence and destruction to make sense. It is securely folded and entrenched in Africana's interiority. Revelation cannot be outed. It is given and received. It is the gift of the unfamiliar, the not yet routinized or encountered in the world. Revelation enhances the world by adding to it. So to conclude, this revelatory principle in negritude is counterpoint to a political paradigm of takings, operating primarily through dispossession and alienation of Black bodies reduced to war commodities in a racialized world. Disclosure that animates revelatory imagination is the substratum and constitution of a Senghorian new humanism. Revelatory disclosure announces the next disclosure and the one that comes after, defying and rendering all conclusion at best provisional. Thank you.
Thank you so much, S.N, for also making our souls dance. I think that was critical in Senghor's work. So thank you for giving us dancing souls. So because I am kind of the moderator here and I have the chance to be the dictator, I'm trying to kind of not allow for that and have a creative imagination, as I've been told just now. And so I would like to see if anyone would like to ask a question. It's time for questions and we can take a few. And then while the questions are being responded to by our co-speakers, they can also then engage with each other's discussions. So thank you. If you have a question, perhaps you can raise your hand. And I hope HUMA people can help us see if there's a question. And then if you have a question, you'll be unmuted by our HUMA staff. So if there's no question, then I can be the dictator I was trying to resist being. And I would like to ask a question that in some ways is thinking through both of what you've offered us today. And as someone who, my background is urban studies, but just thinking through a city that's more just and the power dynamics that are territorialized and the coloniality that's territorialized in the city. And in thinking about, in a lot of what I think about is because the city is seen as this place to launch new modernities, whether it's a big highway or a big skyscraper, these are often seen, these infrastructures are seen as a way to rehabilitate this African who needs a lot of rehabilitation. And through this rehabilitation, what's envisioned is modernity that is often anti-ecology, as you were talking about, Prof. Desiree, anti-Black, anti-queer, anti-human. So then my question is, how can we think about, how can we resist these modernities? Because they're launched on us and they're assailed. We are assailed by them all the time. They're part of, for example, even the African Union's Vision 2063 document. How can we respond to them, react to them, and resist them with stories or with creative imagination? Thank you. Perhaps whoever would like to go first.
I can take a chance and go first. And I'm going to start off by saying, your question makes me think of the Senghor poem, New York. I say to you, let Black blood flow in your veins. And I remember encountering that poem in the context of a class where I was taught in a very typically colonial way to understand that Senghor is an essentialist, negritude is reductive, and this idea of essentializing a sort of a Black way, an African way of thinking was deeply problematic. But those words stayed with me, and the idea of there being what was referred to in your talk, the idea of there being some resilient force, some resilient spirit that would inevitably resist this mechanization, what is ultimately dehumanization in the name of modernity, would always be there. So I suppose my kind of very naive answer to that question is that resistance will always be there. There will always be subcultures, there will always be communities that will resist gentrification, that will have alternative ways of being in the world. They will continue to be beleaguered, but somehow or other they will always be there, because there is, and you know, I think it's not necessarily always kind of associated with particular, it can be linked to people who are from very different locations. So that's just my very spontaneous response to that.
Thank you.
Yes, I think Senghor would probably say that trying to grapple, whether it is a city or urban or village life, you know, from a perspective of scarcity is already a problem. Africana presence, you are present because you are. And therefore, like Desiree was saying, what needs to be done is already there. The issue is that we ourselves tend not to see it or want it or to embrace it because we want to make a point that we are civilized, that we are this and that. That's the point that Achille Mbembe has done, has made in his own critique of a certain kinds of Black reason. And that means we are always reacting to something else. What Senghor says is, you are. And the point is not to define whether you are coming from the situation of scarcity or lack or underdevelopment. It is to recognize that you are coming from where you are. And I think it is really challenging because, I mean, we are always bombarded that you are not enough as women, as queer people, as Africans, as the continent. Africa has never been enough for anybody, with or without roads. And the point is that even if you build those roads, you will still not be enough. That is just a fact. So then the choice is on us to really get back and think and say, okay, am I going to play the game of catching up all the time? Because to catch up presumes that the other person who is ahead of you has stopped, just waiting for you to catch up, right? So it's a game set up for someone else's interest. So as far as developing urban spaces, I mean, what prevents anybody who wants to build anything to do so in consultation with communities, with artists, you know, with people who are actually part of the milieu? It is not done because, in part, we don't value those things. We don't value our own spirit. We don't value our own creativity. Yeah. If it is not stamped with a name that is elsewhere, we don't value. So perhaps the call is really for us as African intellectuals. We're not building, you know, residential areas, but as African intellectuals to get back to that place of true confidence and engagement with our own spirit, because we need our spirit to make the leap to the next challenge.
Thank you so much. And I can see a question from Fatuma. Please go ahead and perhaps you can introduce yourself, Fatuma. Divine, maybe you can unmute Fatuma.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Fatuma Guyo. I am a lecturer at the University of Tennessee. So I have a question that I think is for both Dr. Nyeck and Dr. Lewis. In the context of globalization and changes that are occurring today, what does oppression mean for women? And the reason why I'm asking this question is because I study indigenous societies, indigenous women, and then the idea is that women, like pastoral societies, have been marginalized for so long. And what means really, like, what does it mean when we say, for example, indigenous women are oppressed? Because their oppression is not the same with the oppression faced by, women from elite societies, educated women. Yeah, so thank you.
Perhaps, S.N, if you don't mind, you can start this time.
I am always suspicious of a blank statement that starts like, rural women are oppressed, indigenous women are oppressed. And lo and behold, since we don't have any indigenous left elsewhere, guess where we'll be looking and cataloging oppression? That would be in Latin America, that would be in Africa, and then we'll build evidence for oppression. I think indigenous societies have more to give us today than we actually acknowledge. In terms of political imagination or cultural imagination, colonialism threw away all that was indigenous, told that it wasn't good. No, it wasn't good. Religion out, ways of life out. So we want to embrace the machine. But now those of us who live within the machine, we're finding that very hard, to keep up with, because you have to, feels like you've sold your soul. So why would I start a conversation by stating that indigenous women are oppressed? What makes them oppressed? Is it the fact that they are indigenous? Is it the fact that they are women? And what is this abstract globalization we're talking about? I think we have to perhaps rethink, those parameters, and that's really the point I was trying to make in my talk. That is to say, why should I be looking at a rural woman from the perspective of globalization? What does globalization mean? It means what? You have a cell phone? What? You have a solar panel and not some? Is that all? Like, are we, when we say indigenous, reduced to sound bites and chips? This and that, check you have, check you don't have, and therefore you're oppressed? I'm not saying that there aren't challenges here and there, but why are we not asking the question about what we can actually learn today from those women, as opposed to starting from the perspective of they are oppressed and they need more globalization or more integration into the way we live? So those would be my question to your question.
Yeah, thank you for that. But studies have shown that the impact of globalization is felt more by women at the margin, like pastoral societies, right? I truly understand your point, like shifting our perspective and see these women as agents of change. And yet, my thinking is we cannot just also like assume that they are not marginalized, right? Many of them are not educated. They don't have even the voices to like talk about what is oppressing them. I definitely understand your perspective, but I also see this other side that they are feeling the impact of globalization more than definitely the women that are educated. the women that come from, let's say, I personally come from northern part of Kenya that has been marginalized for so long. And the issue of these mega infrastructure Wangui was talking about is currently located in northern Kenya, the LAPSET project, for example. And the implication for such mega structure is really huge on pastoral land. And definitely women are going to shoulder the impact of those development plans.
Thank you so much, Fatma. Perhaps it's a good chance for Professor Lewis to come in.
Yes, thanks for that question. I hear what you're saying, and I would say that there is no way that we can, ignore the importance of a political economy perspective in thinking about the extent to which subaltern subjects who are gendered, who are classed, who are defined in particular ways within the global economy are exploited in distinctive ways. But I think, to get back to S.N.'s point, I think it's also important for us to think about the extent to which the construct of the suffering African woman has served a particular agenda. And in fact, we can think about this global political economy that we currently inherit as being based on that discursive system of constructing the non-modern, the pre-modern, the woman in need of salvation. Development discourse relies on that construct. So in a sense, the exploitative practices that prey on the kind of women that you are speaking about have been totally linked to the discursive apparatus that is used to prop up those practices. So I think it's important for us to think about the construction of certain subject positions and identities at the same time that we think about the power dynamics that are involved in exploiting certain subjects. They work hand in hand. So yes, of course, there are women who will be exploited in particularly vicious and violent ways by the global economy, despite the fact that we can think about them having certain knowledges and skills and insights and worldviews that are very different and that could actually be very interruptive. S.N., I'm not sure if you want to pick up on that, because I think it's,
No, I think I absolutely agree with you. The point, and just to correct what I said, the point is not to say that they're not oppressed. That wasn't my point. The point is that time and time again, you see the measurement of oppression. They are more than, they are these than, and it is not neutral, right? The point is that where something is disruptive, it disrupts everything and everybody. Now, why is it that we're not talking about that? And then presenting this particular category of women as kind of the site for resistance only. It is a good thing. I'm just drawing attention to that which we haven't really done well, because once we enter into that game, we always do it imperfectly. How do we go back and ask the real question? By the way, those women may not be educated if by education it means learning certain things in certain ways about yourself, but they are certainly educated about something. And why are we not asking ourselves, can we learn from them? That is not a very sexy way of framing the question, because nobody will want that kind of intervention. You need to go and learn from some rural women in Ghana or Kenya or Cameroon. Nobody wants that. That doesn't mobilize action. Why is the real question. Would that prevent us from seeing some of the challenges that they also face after we have treated them as actually people who can reason, think, who have epistemologies about their own lives? Who is afraid of that?
Can I just say one quick thing, sort of just in addition to that? I think that we sometimes underestimate the extent to which development discourses become more and more sophisticated. It has infiltrated our kind of basic fundamental ways of seeing. It's presented as absolutely, unquestionable, neutral. The statistics are there. Who can question the statistics? The experts are there. It doesn't come with an obviously colonial face. It's embedded in our NGOs. It's worked its way into our organizations. So it's a very, very influential discourse, and it's not easy to challenge because it is so dominant and so persuasive. When you contest it, it's almost as if you're saying, well, I really don't care about these women. I'm going to make my rhetorical point about decoloniality and just let them kind of, suffer on the side. So I think that it's a really hard struggle that we're facing now, maybe harder than, say, 2 decades ago, when it was easier to deconstruct and critique development discourse. But I think development discourse now is alive and well and thriving, even as, ironically, an industry of decolonial thinking is thriving in the academy.
So I would like to pick up on that, but before I do, perhaps I should see if there are any questions. I can see one here from Kabeba Badirun asking, what are the resources for creating new logics of value in this globalized world? What are the logics that will create new cognitive domains? So perhaps, Professor Lewis, you can start this time around.
The logics. Habiba, I don't know, you might kind of be on the safe wavelength here, but for me, it's often unexpected how one encounters these logics. I mean, I've found the sort of offerings of different points of view, often through creative work, through the work of artists, through the work of African artists, whether it's Bernie Searle or Yvonne Vera or Bessie Head, most certainly. And again, sometimes one needs to struggle through the kind of lenses that you have set in place due to your own education. When I first read Bessie Head, for example, I struggled to kind of measure her feminism in relation to the feminism that I was being taught in the classroom by white feminists. But the more I immersed myself in her world, the more I was able to think about her talking about character, subjectivity, interpersonal relationships, the relationship between people and the land. Or Yvonne Vera, for example, talking about whose characters in her novel are often seen as two-dimensional, talking about character and the individual subject in a very different way than the idea of identity and the individual subject is valorized under modernity. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of responds to what you are saying, asking.
Thank you. I'm not sure, S.N, would you like to respond to the question posed by Habeba? What are the resources for creating new logics of value in this globalized world?
Yes, I completely agree with Desiree that art is important in creative work. I can just add that at a personal level, I've become more and more interested in African cosmologies and mythologies. I think we haven't done that a lot, perhaps because of the domination of Christianity and Islam, what have you. But I think it is really an untapped source of imagination and storytelling that is very fluid and is potentially able to provide us with new language, new relational language.
Thank you. And because we have 10 minutes, perhaps I will read the 2 questions here, but also tack my own onto the last one that was just asked. Equal to Habeba, I was interested in having you, if you're interested, highlight some of the work that's going on the continent or the places where you work, that the work that's going on that's pushing forward creative imaginations, that's pushing forward new cognitive domains. Perhaps it would be great if you could highlight some of the groups or individuals doing that so that we can also encourage and support them and also become more aware of their work. So I've tacked my question on to the last one. And then there's also the question by Mary in the chat saying, what about the role of capitalism in the funding of development? I think this is also in response to Professor Lewis's discussion of the sinister way that development discourse is becoming more sophisticated. There's also the question by Sanya, who says he would have liked to have heard discussions of the work of the likes of Oyeronke Oyewumi and Ifeoma Diume, who have confronted the modernity and tradition dichotomy and the place of indigenous knowledges in African modernities. Perhaps those 3 questions are good for now, and I've just been notified that there's a question by Gavaza and Mary Hayes. So would you like to attend to these 3 questions first and then conclude by responding to the last 2? Yeah, I hope that can work for you.
Okay, I think we're just going to kind of try and share them between us as far as we can. So just in terms of work that's being done at the moment, I have to stress that the role of the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa has been very, very significant. And there's been a lot of work among different kinds of groups, students, and a lot of emphasis on creative innovation and refusing the kind of, just the regimentation that's associated with working in disciplines and working according to a formula. I hope I don't embarrass her because I saw her coming online earlier on, but there's somebody called Jackie Job who works, for example, at the University of Cape Town's drama school. And she's been doing amazing work in terms of rethinking dance, refusing totally the sort of Western-centric approach to dance. And these are the kinds of processes that are underway at the moment. And I'm very glad to see that they aren't kind of large-scale movements, because I think large-scale movements are always a problem, but they are collectives among artists, among students, among especially younger academics that are very promising. So I'm not being specific, and maybe I could be more specific if you were to email me and just kind of think up names, but that movement I think has been really important. God, what was I've forgotten the other questions. I'm really getting old. It's also kind of late for me. So what were the other questions? S.N, do you want to take over and I'll respond to some? I can't remember the other question.
Sorry, it was on discussing Oyeronke, Oyewumi, and Ifeoma.
Oh, yes, no, that's a crucial question. Thank you, Sanya, and very good to hear from you. It's been a very long time. This is the amazing thing about the lockdown. Yes, neither of us mentioned Ifeoma Diume or Oyeronke Oyewumi, although they have been for years saying what Maria Lugones is now saying, talking about the fact that gender is actually a very colonialist concept, talking about the coloniality of gender and talking about the way in which pre-colonial African societies have been organized in very, very different ways, and that the seemingly liberatory frameworks, theoretical paradigms that seem to be offered by feminism and so on, often lock us into ways of codifying our world in very rigid ways. So yes, it is a huge omission to have left them out, but certainly they should feature very prominently. And I think your question also is a reminder of just how often African-centered knowledge is left out. Because I think in a lot of the discussion of decolonial feminism, there is an acknowledgement of Ifi, Amadume, and Oyewumi, but not as much as they should be, considering that their work was done a very long time ago. I think I'll pause there.
Thank you.
Maybe I will start by addressing the issue of Ifi and Oyeronke. I did not draw from them. In fact, I drew from a man. I've been reading a lot recently from womanist, the womanist tradition in the United States. For those who are not familiar with that tradition, womanists, they don't claim to be feminist. They claim to have the interests of the Black community at heart, both men, Black men, and Black women in the United States. And I found that really interesting because I think that the same fragmentation that Ifi and Oyeronke are talking about in terms of gender has happened also in the ways in which feminism position itself. So we don't really have ways of talking to our men, to Black men, and yet they are very much part of the racialized struggle. So in that sense, I would say, and there is a question by Sarojini, and I'm addressing it right here, to say that the reason why gender is either non-existent or just completely not what we expect it to be, a la Oyeronke and Ifi Amedium, it is because of the African cosmology. It is because of the overarching framework that allows those societies that they study to act differently, to live differently. So then what happened, and this is, I think, the question Sarojini is raising, that in doing feminism and practicing feminism, sometimes on the one hand, we want to push back, but what it is also sold, it is a world without spirituality, for example, not, withstanding the fact that it was a spiritual foundation within the African continent that allowed people to organize themselves in one way or the other. So that is sort of tied to my own journey, from being a political economy type of person to being interested now in culture, in film, in religion, and all of those things. So in terms of who inspires me, like Desiree said, you can email me. I hope you have my email. But the point really is that for me today, I am interested in reading everybody. I am absolutely interested in reading everybody, because those we read as well as those we don't are part of the conversation. And I do think that men who have contributed significantly must be reappropriated in ways that give them their dues in the construction of Africana self. I don't think that goes against anything African per se. So I am fighting this sort of balkanization and fragmentation when it comes to gender. We're talking about one thing, we're talking about the whole thing. There is no future for African feminism if all our men end up on drugs and locked away and whatever, or being gunned down, and only all of us are standing. That would not be the kind of gender that Oyeronke is talking about. That would not be the kind of society that they found in their own research. So I think this sort of binaries has to be exploded in some ways, and we have to do it confidently. Like, we don't have to to practice or embrace the kind of feminism that is no longer serving us or hasn't really. Perhaps that's why I left the feminist side to Desiree, and I sort of went on the other spectrum talking about the human.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I know it's late for quite a few people. Perhaps if Kavaza is still interested in asking the question, this can be a good time for you to ask the question and then have our speakers respond as part of their closing remarks.
Yeah, okay. Thank you both for your presentations. They were really thought-provoking. And they made me think around the question of presence, because you mentioned presence and then also the notion of feminism. So how do we bring those two together in thinking through around questions of robotics? I think today we're talking about robots. In Japan, they talk about them as sex slaves or labor and slavery in some way. And also they talk about colonizing Mars. So the same language that was used to describe Africa, to describe African people, is being used to describe robots. So how do we think around the notion of presence? And also how do we then bring that into conversation with the notion that when they are speaking about robots as sex slave or slave labor for women, it's to help women so that we can work more and have children. So I just wanted to bring those two conversations together, because I think there's a lot here coming from both of you that we can bring together to think about something that is actually very important today, because we are all moving, in this direction of advancement and modernity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavaza. Either Professor Lewis or S.N, you can respond to that. And I hope it's okay if you suture that to your closing remarks.
Okay, no, I think I'll just respond to both Kavaza and Sarojini. Thank you so much for that question about spirituality. But just about Kavaza, I think it gets back to the question of which modernity do we have in mind? So the sort of Western-centric Euro-modernity assumes that all individuals are materialistic, wanting to accumulate more, needing extra assistance in order to get more, and that robots need to be instrumentalized. So the world is always instrumentalized. The non-human is always instrumentalized. So I think one needs to go back to that foundation of, why are certain inventions, why are certain God thought of in the first place? What is the framework that guides our sense of how to progress? So Rajani's question about spirituality according to Western modernity, has been kind of totally shunned and criticized and condemned. Post-Enlightenment thought was very suspicious of spirituality because it was associated with Christianity, with religion, which was at the time deeply hierarchical. But of course, spirituality opens up numerous ways of seeing and thinking about the world in relation to something that we don't understand. So for me, I think that it's really important for us to get over our anxieties, our deep anxieties, because as soon as you speak about spirituality, you immediately seem to be somebody who's kind of somehow missing the plot. So yeah, thank you for that comment. It is for me crucial in terms of thinking about decoloniality.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis. S.N, please.
Yes, I want to address the question of robotics. In the essay I was engaging with, Senghor talks about works of art, and he focuses on sculpture. And he gives the reason why. So he says, because he was interested in wood. And he said, everywhere you go in Africa, you can find wood. Right? And what he says is that his work of animation has at least two levels. One is understanding life, the spirit, life-giving presence that is already part of an African presence. It is just there. The second is to understand the artistic work of animating the world. And he thought that the sculpture is a great example of how it is done. So the issue here is less about the fear of technology for just the sake of being fearful of technology, is to ask the question, what kind of life is this particular technology bringing about or displacing or inventing? And to the extent that we as creators, we make these robots, we make these decisions, are there ways that we can animate them for better ends as opposed to annihilation, as opposed to chaos, as opposed to anxiety, as opposed to more fragmentation of life? I think that is the ethical question that must be asked. But that requires that we have a framework in mind to begin with, to steer innovation, not in that way, but in this way. Unfortunately and realistically, very few, I doubt nobody here on this call is a venture capitalist. So what would decide or make that decision is none of us here, people who have money and do these things. So that's what I would say. And so in conclusion, I would just say thank you for this time, and thank you, Desiree, for accepting to be part of the conversation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for being our inaugural speakers and for powerfully launching our series of webinars. We hope that you will join us at the next ASAA conference at UCT in April next year. And thank you once again for your time. Just for those, before I invite Professor Adomako to give the closing remarks, just to say that our next conversation as part of the HUMA and ASAA Thinking the Human Through Africa speaker series, we will be having it on July 27th, and the theme will be giving and being human in Africa. We'll confirm the speakers in a few weeks, so please follow us on our website. You can look at the calendar of events as well as through social media. So thank you once again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Wangui, for steering us through this. And of course, to our formidable speakers, Desiree and S.N. Nyeck, they did not fail to deliver our expectations, and possibly beyond our expectations. There hasn't been enough time to go into so many other things, but I think, I know that our conversation this afternoon, listening to the questions and the responses, it just tells us how important the theme that we have picked about, humanness, humanity, what it means, the Africana epistemologies is, I don't want to say that the moment is so important, but I do have to say the moment, we all know the moment that we are living in. And of course, to thank both of them for doing this so elegantly, so easy to connect with, right? I'm an academic, and sometimes it's like, okay, academics are talking and it's up here, and even I am having a hard time. But today's conversation was so easy for us, I believe, to relate, to connect, to push our own thinking. To a big thanks to HUMA, to Divine, to all of you for partnering with us. I am so deeply grateful to have such thoughtful and generous partners to work with, this is the reflection of all that is good about the human. And there will be those moments when we'll talk about the challenges that we are having, the things that that trouble us, the issues we are dealing with that come from our societies but also come from outside, and unpacking that bifurcation that we do, that this is not African and it came from somewhere, all of that. So looking forward to the next one, and to all of you joining us on that one, as well as to the conference next year. And please submit those panels. We still have a little over 24 hours. Well, I don't know what exactly how much time we're closing, you know, whose clock we are using, but we'll be generous. So please, you have another day, submit those panels. We really need the ones from the continent especially, and you know, start thinking about the abstracts that you're going to submit. And if you don't have a passport, please, I beg of you, hurry up and get one. So salute you all. Good evening.
Many thanks again, and have a good evening.